Our experts here today will be able to share with you their experiences in a variety of regions, African region, the Asia-Pacific region, the Latin American region, and Sam can give a sort of global economic overview of the activity in this area. So with that, we don't have any particular order and no one has prepared remarks, but I thought that in our hour here, we would try to spend about 40 minutes, about 10 minutes per person, talking about their experiences and issues, and save the last 20 minutes or so for an open discussion. Ariel, would you like to begin?
Good morning, everyone. Just as a discussion yesterday with Bill, I mentioned a case that we have at the very south of the world in Argentina. It's a town in the middle of the mountains. The latitude is south 41 and is 71 east, just to be clear, where it's very south and deep. This is a small tourist town. It's typical mountain with a lake, and the main activity is tourism. And they start a connection to internet with 40 megs for all the town. And they are almost 500 kilometers far to the nearest city. So how we improve this connectivity, how we change the reality for them. And the challenge was to connect to the IXP, which is in the North Patagonia in Argentina, and try to get them from the $1,800 per meg for these 40 megs for the whole town, to a situation to have more than 500 megs to a cost of almost $30 per meg. And I'm talking about the wholesale business, and how this affects the town, because at the beginning with the 40 meg for the town, it's almost impossible to connect. It's more or less 20,000 people, inhabitants in this town, plus the visitors. So it was very difficult for them to reach the IXP because there was no infrastructure. And I guess, and I think that the very important point is how we resolve the problem of the last mile for these kind of towns. And we decided to develop a microwave radio connection for almost the 500 kilometers crossing the mountains. And when we get it, they increase the first step from the 40 megs to 150 megs, and they occupy the whole capacity in a day. So was saturated the link. Then they realized that they need a better connection, and we developed a fiber optic infrastructure, and in a year we reached the point where the link on the fiber was ready, and they increased the bandwidth to 500 megs. And at that point we get, in terms of the end users, 5 times better connections, and they now are able to have VOD systems, at least in the 40 megs for the whole town was impossible. So the challenge was to change the reality of this town, connecting to an internet exchange point where the infrastructure and the wholesale bandwidth is available. Because for towns in the middle of nowhere, like the Patagonia, you need to reach the infrastructure. The infrastructure does not reach you. So this was the challenge that we give to them, and they did it, and now they have a very, very good connection, and they are developing an IPTV solution and a VOD system because it's affordable for them now. So, as an example of how the reality of one small town in the middle of the mountains, we can see the difference from the cost and the amount of bandwidth from one point to the other when the infrastructure is ready. So, just as a trigger to the discussion for everyone, this is the first comment that I give.
Ariel, you're talking about this in the context of a country which has been rapidly adding exchange points. So if it cost, I think you said $1,800 US per megabit per bandwidth per month in this small town originally, that at that time may well have been in the context of a country as a whole that was still importing a lot of its bandwidth, but at the same time that you were connecting this small town better to the rest of the country and the other exchange points in that country, those exchange points themselves were producing more and more bandwidth within Argentina. Could you talk a little bit about not only how the prices have come down in that town, but how the prices have come down in Argentina as new exchange points have been brought online?
Yeah. The first IXP point that we have was starting operation on 1997 and with 10 members. And at that point, very in the beginnings of the Argentinian interconnection to the world, we can say that the price, the average price for the whole country was $400 per meg at that time. Then we came in the early 90s for $40,000 per 64K. Yeah, that was the starting point. That was the starting point. $40,000 for 64K at the early 90s. Yeah, when we switched from X25 to TCP/IP, that was the starting point of that.
And that would have been bandwidth being hauled down from Washington D.C., right? From the May East in Washington D.C.
Yeah, and then we connect to one point in the. I guess at the end of the 90s, we get one point to Florida. Yeah.
And in Florida, obviously, there's a large exchange point called NOTA, Napa of the Americas in Miami, that serves a lot of bandwidth to Latin America. Coincidentally, intra-regional competition led to the exchange in Sao Paulo being started in the same month, November of 1997, as the Buenos Aires exchange. Could you talk a little bit about how long it took before Brazilian ISPs participated in Buenos Aires and before Argentine ISPs participated in Sao Paulo, and whether there were rules or policies that affected that?
Yeah, and I also want to mention that we have different models. The first thing is that the IXPs in Argentina are all interconnected by ourselves, because there was a situation, and there is a situation with the carriers that they don't want to connect the IXPs and so we did it. In the Brazilian model, they are not interconnected, and the carriers sells different traffic between them. So this is the main difference. And now we have 15 in Argentina, IXP, and Brazil is almost 22, yes, or more now. I don't know, maybe 25. And the model is different because also the model is different in Brazil. You participate in one exchange point, and there is no obligation to exchange traffic with all of the members. And in the Argentinian model, we have a multilateral agreement. If you are connected to one internet exchange point, you must accept all the traffic for the rest of the members of all the internet exchange point, and put your traffic for all of them too.
Nishal, could you discuss your experiences in South Africa and in Africa generally, and perhaps you could pick up where Ariel left off on the topic of mandatory multilateral peering and what experiments you've seen done there?
Thanks, Bill, and good morning, everybody. My name's Nishal. As Bill says, I work at PCH. I'm also responsible for 3 internet exchange points in South Africa, the Jinx, Sinks, and Dinks, and I work closely with a lot of the internet exchanges in our region. So we have a slightly different model. Just drawing on what we do at the INCSs, we've always believed that the model for peering should be on as determined by the ISP perspective. So our perspective on running the internet exchanges is that we operate a highly available, neutral exchange platform, and people that connect to the internet exchanges are free to choose whom they want to pair with and how they want to pair with it. In fact, we're slightly different even from the start. That was like 1996 now. Jinx has even allowed people to sell transit if they wanted to across the internet exchange point. Our focus has solely been on running just a platform and letting people interconnect, and provided they follow the general rules of the exchange point, the nice, polite rules, don't do the nasty things that, the technical things that are in place. You could literally do whatever it is that you wanted. Touching on some of the other things that you've mentioned, you asked about the return of investment. Well, we're not quite the most southern part of the world. I think that goes to you. But Cape Town, for example, is pretty far down there if you know anything about geography. And obviously, coming from such a southern part of the world, establishing internet infrastructure so early in the internet ecosystem, way back in the mid-90s, when transmission costs were just incredible. If I had to work out the return of investment, in fact, I was doing the math while my colleague was speaking, I think I would put that down to about 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, the amount of traffic that we could get exchanged through the Johannesburg exchanges and then later through the Cape Town exchanges, we managed to pay off what we otherwise would have been spending on at that stage, transmission costs to get our traffic transferred, and then it was in the United States via Sprint and BBN, if I remember correctly. It wasn't even in Europe at that stage. So, I would definitely mark that off as totally a gain for us, yeah.
PCH has a survey that's still in progress, but basically what we've observed is that 90% of internet exchange points are built for a cost between $4,000 US and $40,000 US, and almost all of them pay for themselves in somewhere between a few days, 3 or 4 days, and 2 or 3 weeks. It's very rare to find an exchange point that doesn't earn back its initial investment within a few weeks. Pinder, do you want to spend a little bit of time talking about your experiences with the very early exchanges?
Okay, so let's start off with an opening statement, which I believe the internet is built, not bought. This is the difference here, is that many people have the concept of the internet from just buying service. But if you're in the business of providing internet service, you actually have to go through the business of the internet physics of interconnectivity. In the early 90s, in 1993 in Hong Kong, it was a very, very competitive situation. And indeed, it did cost $50,000, $40,000 actually, $40,000 to go across from Hong Kong to the United States for 164 kilobit. The reason why I know is that was the first commercial connection in Hong Kong, was from Hong Kong to SprintNet, and it cost that amount for 64K. It was a period at that point in time, the fact that you had a bigger pipe going across the Pacific was for commercial advantage. And so the one with the deeper pocket would get multi-homed across the Pacific. And it was only until, I think, 1995, with the decommissioning of the then NSFNet backbone, and also we had a controversy in Hong Kong where a lot of the people who run ISPs didn't know they needed a license. So long story short, at HKIX in Hong Kong, as you know, we have one of the world's best access for broadband, also mobile. And I think HKIX is one of our great success stories. So what I would like to focus on is not so much the economics. I think, keeping your currency in your country and not shipping it overseas is of interest. I'm also not going to talk about network performance. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. This morning I wasn't quite sure why the video feeds were not. Is there an internet exchange point in Turkey?
Yes, there is, but it's relatively small. It's a Terramark facility like NOTA that's been here for about 6 years.
So the experience of trying to keep traffic local to Hong Kong, we've also got a burgeoning content industry, which again uses Hong Kong Internet Exchange Point, run by the local university. So at that point in time, we couldn't trust each other. We're all commercial competition, but we could trust a neutral third party. In this case, it was the Chinese University of Hong Kong, which until this day runs the exchange point. The good news is that they only came to ask for funds for the government after I think 15 years. And at that point in time, it goes to show that the recuperation of the cost can be done if there's community support. So what I would like to point to is the social dimensions and the economic dimensions. And really here is if you're going to drive a digital economy, you need the engineers to do that. And those engineers need to know the internet physics of how the internet actually is built. They need to have full command of that. And you're going to make a lot of mistakes like we did in Hong Kong. So one way to do that, and one way to get that experience, is to trial and error, and to do so in a rapid iteration. So Hong Kong Internet Exchange Point is what I would point to, a great place where we could try and keep local traffic local, so we don't sort of export our money, but also increase the usability of that. And so within Asia, it wasn't quite clear exactly how to build one of these. So we had in Hong Kong in 1996, the first Apricot meeting, the thing that we taught was how to build an internet exchange point, and we built an internet exchange point in a hotel. The point here is that how do you have a project whereby it's quite easy to see the economic benefits, but it's not so easy to see the social benefits? The social benefits of having an operators group that gets around regularly to meet and discuss the internet exchange point. Do they really discuss internet exchange point? Yeah, perhaps for about 5 minutes, and then they go off and do something else. Talk about the beer. And that's the trust building that goes along. Why is this important? Well, all of our different roles change. Now, in fact, in those early days, there was also another gentleman who was one of the early pioneers, is Charles Mock, who's sitting right there. He is our IT legislator. Now, way back when, we were competitors. And I hated him, and he hated me because we were competitors. And that's the nature of the business. And we're now sitting around the same table wearing different hats. And that's the interesting thing, is that these engineers, they will change companies, they will change jobs, they will go up and down the stack, but their trust within each other over the years, that really cements the community. And as their roles change, it's that community which will drive the society. Where we've moved on from Hong Kong is not just talking about internet exchange points, but looking at other forms of exchange. So in Hong Kong over the last year, we've built 5 intellectual property exchanges. Now the concept here is quite similar, which is where the money is. So it's not just routing packets. We're going up the stack, routing intellectual property here. So the point being is that how do you build the engineering trust to build your local industry if that's what you're going to do? And I would suggest an internet exchange point, if you haven't got one, is a very good starting point. However, there is a downside. Now last year at the IGF, you mentioned it was post-Snowden. And one of the things that came out of the Snowden revelations is this whole aspect of, if you gather all your local traffic in one spot, that's a pretty good honeypot. That's a pretty good target for mass surveillance. So my question is, where are the boundaries? I would say that any equipment that goes into an exchange point needs to be basically vouched for by the manufacturer. And there needs to be blowback, because that whole incident in Hong Kong, I was extremely upset about, because it was a great community project. Spying on the open internet and open exchange point is not exactly difficult, but it breaks the trust. And that trust is what I think is most important about building and driving the economy, not just trust within Hong Kong per se, but trust across, and that's why participating in these forums is important. Thank you.
I think the note that Pinder brings up about trust and community between the engineers who do this work is a really important one. That one of the things that we see going into developing economies that don't yet produce their own bandwidth and are not thriving is that the internet service providers are all kind of at each other tooth and nail, and none of them trust each other, because they are competing directly against each other for customers, and they don't really share any common interests other than maybe some legislative or regulatory ones. But internet bandwidth is produced collaboratively, right? Internet service providers come together at exchange points to produce the bandwidth, and once they realize that, once the ISPs realize that, they have to make this huge mental shift from the other ISP is my competitor who I do not trust and will not break bread with, to they're the people with whom I collaboratively produce the product that I sell to my customers, and if they sell to another customer, I win, and if I sell to another customer, they win. And I mean, one of the things that we saw in the US is that as soon as we all figured this out, we all started going out for sushi together on Thursday nights, East Coast and West Coast. But that plays out over and over. You go from having this very tense dynamic between internet service providers to a very community-based, collaborative one. Yeah.
Can I just illustrate this further? Because you think the competition is the other ISP, but what we didn't realize is that the competition is actually one of your customers. Because in the internet service provider industry, it can be that your downstream customer eventually grows so large to eat you up or to become your competitor. So in fact, the competition is everywhere. Driving your costs to become the least cost provider is certainly what you want to do, but at the same time, you want to be very, very focused on where your value add is. And it's probably not going to be on the aggregate cost of bandwidth unless you want to aggregate and become really large, really quick. Last point, at some point I want to touch on de-peering.
Yes, I want to mention also that not only the ISP are part of the IX point. Content providers are very important for us. Content providers means for us the need to not go outside our country to get the content. So develop content inside our countries is very important to reduce the cost and increase the quality and improve the quality, and so content providers like universities, like any producer of media are very important members, and in our case are connected to our internet exchange point.
And that can be television stations, local newspapers, all kinds of things like that, that in a global marketplace might not be competitive, but if you have a local exchange point, suddenly they have an economic advantage over the global providers like CNN or the New York Times. Nishal, did you?
I wanted to add to that point about local content creation. There are lots of, depending on which forum you'll sit at, you'll listen to lots of talk. There's an 80-20 proposition, for example, by the African Union to get 80% of Africa's content housed in Africa. That's not possible if you don't have an internet exchange point. So today, I don't know how familiar most of you are with Africa, but if you look at Africa, we're literally buying services from the rest of the world, with the exception of 3 of the more developed economies, and that's Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa. And the one thing that all those three have in common is that they've all been running sort of well-run, almost professional internet exchange points for a very long time. If you look at the participants at those exchanges, one of the largest participants at the Kenyan internet exchange point, for example, is the Kenyan Revenue Authority Services, the guys that collect tax, right? The ones we all love to hate. In fact, the KRA plays such a big role at the exchange point that they have pushed the exchange point operators to diversify their services and to make the services high available. They've pushed for the addition of a second site so that they could be always on, so that people would always be paying their taxes. I know, like I said, love to hate, but it's working. It's working for the Kenyans. If I look at the South African context, one of the busiest peers we have at the Johannesburg exchange point is a bank. People who are not generally known to be super smart or super techie smart anyway, but a bank, because it's convinced that its future lies in providing e-services. Now you have no hope, as you said, Bill, of being able to compete in the global economy without actually having and running well-managed local internet exchange points, or even then extending that into more connected into the economies around you. That's, you know, exchange points are the catalyst for all of that.
Sam, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your experiences with the carrier interconnection and so forth, and perhaps lead into a discussion with Pinder about peering and de-peering and why people interconnect and why they choose not to.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I wanted also to make a point about local content. We've been doing these workshops here for quite a while, and one of the most interesting stories was early on. And it was after Packet Clearinghouse helped establish an internet exchange point in Nepal. And just kind of by the by, it was mentioned what the day with the highest traffic exchange was during the first year. And it was when the local high school results came out. Now, if you think about it, before that time, those local high school results would have gone via Paris, London, San Francisco, without any real need to do so. And the cost of that was passed on to the internet users. So as I listened to the people on this panel that have much more experience with establishing IXPs, because I'm probably the interloper here that hasn't established an IXP, you know, what the lessons I draw for them is one on self-governance. So there's various tweaks to the model, but there's a good governance model for established internet exchange points with a best practice model, and it's really built around self-governance, and that's what they're talking about really when they're talking about sushis. The second thing is cost reduction. I mean, one thing you hear here is not about how much money we're going to make. I mean, of course, all the IXPs and the whole internet ecosystem is built around customers at the end of their model paying for whatever the service or whatever the activity is. But this discussion today is about how we reduce our costs. How do we get the costs down? And that is built around what is a very successful model for internet traffic exchange. And if you look at how the internet has scaled, it's because of that successful model where everyone is trying to reduce their costs. You know, these guys aren't trying to necessarily pass their costs to other people, they're trying to reduce their costs. The danger to that is, and this was Pinder's point about the honeypot, and he mentioned the security issue, but of course there's also the area of how the money flows. And it's also a honeypot for other people, because they see this as one of the potential bottlenecks or choke points, or wherever you can find one on the internet, whether it's domain names or whatever it is, try and apply a governance externally to that activity and somehow try and extract rents from that. And that's one of the main dangers facing internet exchange points. You know, they've been so successful because they do have a self-governance model. But the threats to that come as more attention and as more, attention. It comes towards the internet as it becomes such a central part of the economy. And that could be the issue of surveillance, it could be how the money flows, it could be the internet supplanting the old telecoms networks, and when they converge towards that, you have this whole debate around trying to take previous models for telecommunication exchange of traffic and apply them to the internet. And you can see it all the time. You can see it with, I believe in the Caribbean this year, with blocking of Skype, because people saw that as somehow bypassing what they regard as appropriate termination. You can see it in countries where they try and create white lists for VPNs, and if you're not there, suddenly your corporate network is knocked off the network. And all this is about trying to force that traffic through either an international gateway or an internet exchange point or some other place where you can apply a different form of governance. And I guess that leads into the discussion about de-peering and so forth. Over to you, Pinder.
Sure. Well, I think two words, de-peering and renesis. They have some great studies that illustrate the political and the business dimension of when it made sense for us to peer initially, but then I realized that I'm getting a bad deal or it's not in my strategic example, and I suddenly de-peer. Now, if that only affected the two of us, that's probably fine. But sometimes if it's done ungracefully, it has cascade effects. So it's not all one way. As long as we think about the opportunity to agree and peer, that there's the opposite, which I think I'm not hearing too much talk on, is that sometimes it can go terribly wrong, and the de-peering aspect. So that's it.
We've actually seen a lot of politics around that, particularly in the United States in the last 6 months, around Netflix, which is one of the largest content networks in the world, versus Comcast, which is one of the largest eyeball networks, or the largest eyeball network in the United States, which is Comcast, or Netflix's primary market. And so there's disagreement about whether Comcast is exercising an abuse of market power because they have a near monopoly on the last mile, whether Netflix is somehow trying to take advantage of Comcast's infrastructural investment without making a similar investment of their own, which that's kind of a misunderstanding of how the internet gets built. The exchange point is where networks meet, and so unlike in the telephony network where a payment might cross an exchange point, in the internet the exchange point is where the buck stops, as it were. Well, another thing that Sam brought up is the danger of excess rents being extracted at exchange points, because this is where the value is coming from. You know, people who look at money carefully, they rob the banks because that's where the money is, right? So just a quick anecdote about that. Of sort of large, relatively developed economies, India is one of the largest ones that produces a tiny, tiny fraction of the bandwidth that they use. India is a huge economy that uses a lot of bandwidth, yet still imports almost all of that, produces very, very small amount domestically. And a big part of the reason why India is so far behind in developing their production capacity is because in 2000, many of you may remember a company of self-congratulatory amateur economists called Enron. The first exchange point in India was built by Enron, and Enron thought that they were creating a trading platform for internet packets, and that this would allow bankers to extract the maximum possible value from each transaction of a packet. And so, of course, India winds up sort of 10 years behind as a result of all of the kind of misconceptions about traffic exchange that came out of that. Fortunately, the rest of the world, internet service providers have kind of stuck up for themselves and worked collaboratively. Yeah, Pinder.
I think you draw a very important point. I just came from a session before the session which was about sort of internet terminology and how the internet physics works. And the question in the back of my mind is, why is it important for policymakers to understand internet physics? And I think, Bill, that's the exact reason why it's very important to understand the internet physics, because it can have actually really long-term consequences if your policy is wrong.
Sorry, I just wanted to give an operational comment. So could you please speak to the microphone when, because it's very difficult to hear in this noisy room. Thank you.
Sorry, yes, I realize we're up against a coffee break, I think, outside. We're, I guess, a bit more than halfway through our session. Perhaps we can enliven the conversation with some comments and questions from the rest of the room. Anyone have anything? Sir.
Okay, thank you, Turhan Muluk, Intel. The cost of the internet exchange point is not so high, not expensive. But if you look to the globally, the many countries still do not have the exchange points. And who should lead for the establishment of this exchange point in the countries? Governments, internet organizations, ISPs? I don't know. Thank you.
Can I understand your question correctly? You said the cost of establishing the internet exchange point is not high, and who should actually set that up? Is that correct? I would actually disagree with you. The physical cost is not high. The trust cost is huge. The level of trust you have to build between the ISPs who are competing to say, okay, let's start an internet exchange point, that cost is very high. And in Hong Kong, as I mentioned, we did not trust each other. We were in competition, but we all agreed that my enemy's enemy is my friend. And so we kind of agreed that the local university, in Hong Kong's case, was the one to trust. Before the commercial internet service providers in Hong Kong was the academic networks. And so I dropped out of university at that point in time to do the commercial stuff. So the academic networks knew how the internet physics worked. And in fact, they were better than the commercial types, in fact, almost. So I would say that I would rephrase the question of, who in your local community do you all agree you can trust? In some cases, it may be the government. In some cases, the government's the last thing you want. And it's very difficult to answer that question because the politics, and there is politics, is always local.
I totally agree. And let me tell our history. The physical cost was just a switch for us at the beginning, but took more than a year of 12 different ISPs sitting on a table discussing the way to start. And this was the extremely huge cost. The discussion over more than a year, 14 months discussions once a week from different ISP in the main city of Argentina, Buenos Aires, how to start and run and putting the rules on the table that all will agree. That was the main point. The second one that we opened took us 9 months. Now we are running 15. It's fastest, the process now. We learned the lesson.
So, just speaking for my own organization, because this is the primary thing that we do, we've been through this process more than 200 times now, and what we've observed is that most exchange points take at least 8 months to get started. 8 months of the internet service providers talking with each other and sort of reaching an appropriate level of trust that, and also investment in the outcome, that they will have confidence and that they will invest themselves in the process of building. Even though the monetary cost is very low, as you've all noted, the internal cost for a network is much higher than the shared cost. So you have to build out your network to reach that exchange point. And if you don't have confidence that after you've made that investment, the exchange point will be productive for you, then you're unlikely to make that investment in the first place. And so that's one of the big hurdles to overcome, the initial trust there. And so, we've seen it happen in as little as 3 or 4 months, but that's very rare. We've also seen it take 5, 6, 7 years before the ISPs come to trust each other enough. You asked who should take the lead. Ultimately, it's the ISPs, the network operators, who have to reach that trust and work together. There are places where they simply have not yet gotten it together to do that. One interesting example, Jamaica just got their first exchange point up in the last month, but 3 weeks ago, yeah. And this was the end point of a process that, I mean, 6, 7, well, 3 years on this particular effort, but I remember we were doing workshops there 6 or 7 years ago. And that was a process that was led by the regulator. So the government had to push the ISPs to get them to come to that level of trust with each other. I remember the first time we went in to do a workshop, the government, the regulator brought in all of the regulated entities and sat them down and said, here, listen to this. And they all said, we're not listening to this. You're the regulator, you work for us. You have to set a floor on the minimum amount any of us can charge a customer. So, you know, there are very different entry points for this conversation.
And can I draw on this point, because I think one of the beauties of the Internet Governance Forum, you know, because what I view what we're doing in all these different sessions is in fact actually trust building. Because ultimately within the internet physics is that you've got the ITF and all these different groups doing standards, but they will have to trust the output, or ICANN or what have you, before they go home and actually implement things. And so how we have a distributed trust process through dialogue, through training, etc., is kind of what I view some of the aspect of the multi-stakeholder approach. It's open, but the people at the round of the table, if I see them again and again, and I know where they're coming from, I may not agree with them, but over time you can build trust. And with ISPs, in a very small instance, there's a very clear business model, a clear value proposition, which makes that hopefully quite easy. And we've been discussing this for 15 years. Yeah.
Next question. Sir.
Hi, my name is Adli Wahid from APNIC, one of the regional IRRs in Asia Pacific. I would like to just go back on the topic of capability development, which is one of the requisites for building or facilitating the build-up of IXPs. In a lot of places, getting quality and good knowledge on things like routing, security, RPKIs, you know, IP addresses, IPv6 are quite expensive. Not only in terms of getting the technical know-how to come to deliver the training, but also in terms of sometimes requiring people to travel to places to get the knowledge itself. So at APNIC, one of the things that we find quite useful is actually in terms of trying to get knowledge across to a lot of people on a low-cost basis is one, partnering with the local NOGs, the Network Operators Group, which also means sometimes helping the local community to build a NOG, because this would allow you to accomplish few objectives. One is to create that trust. So get people from different places of different companies to sit together and discuss on how to make things better. But also at the same time, we can address the issue of getting the knowledge across on a very economical basis. And in Asia Pacific, for instance, there are many places or many countries where recently they started NOGs, or Network Operators Group. So this year I think there was one new NOG in Indonesia. And in some places like Bhutan or Nepal, where they can't establish their own NOG, they would go to a regional one, which is called SANOG. So we find that these are places that you can get this message across and help support with relevant information or knowledge. And on the other thing, with regards to distributing knowledge, APNIC, we do provide e-learning on a weekly basis. So on topics like routing, security, IPv6, the success or the measurement for success is very hard to see. But of course, this is also another avenue for people to acquire knowledge. So to conclude, there is value, I think, in supporting the NOGs and encouraging and getting them in this type of discussion. And also, this would eventually facilitate the development of IXPs and, of course, facilitate the development of access to knowledge and the internet in the long run.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more strongly. we teach about 120, the PCH, the organization that Nishal and I work for, teach about 120 workshops a year. Many of those, the majority of those are in connection with network operators group meetings or USTTI or other forums like that where we can get a bunch of people in from different places to share information. I know there's NSRC also does training of that sort. Vijay or Malcolm, do you want to talk about European outreach efforts in that area?
Hi, so I'm Bijal Sangani from EuroIX. EuroIX is an association for internet exchanges, and what we do in, I mean, there are lots of initiatives in Europe already. We're working together actually with ISOC and other bodies to do some outreach, and not necessarily training, but just more a case of passing knowledge, explaining from, going through what the experiences that we've had and seen throughout Europe. One of, like you were talking about earlier, like trust and community building is key. What I've seen is that the internet exchanges that come about, which are community-led, you know, there's one in the UK, IX Leeds, for example. You know, Leeds is a very small city, and they felt the need for, there was enough network operators there who came together and felt the need for an internet exchange. It's now been running for over 2 years and is very successful and growing. So I think, you know, like talking about the trust and the community aspect of it is really important, and bringing the community together and doing that via NOGs, other meetings like the RIR meetings. EuroIX, we have 2 meetings a year as well.
Thank you. We've got some questions online, and then maybe I'll come back to.
No, I have Alexis Semeka, RIP Community, and I just want to add some notes about the situation with IXPs in Russia. Our experience in Russia, we have several dozens of IXPs, and the largest one has like 400 members, so it's pretty large. And each of IXP I know in Russia on some stage became the enabler of local internet business. If some city or small town has own internet exchange, in this city we have first local providers and new local providers because they understand how to do this business. ISP allows him to understand this business easily, and this is very important for us. And local internet content business. I can illustrate it on the very similar cities. In one we have IXPs, and in the other city nearby we don't have ISP. And in the first one we have strong local content providers, and in the second, no. So this is way to enable our business. It's a very important point for me to understand that.
And do you find that data centers have been springing up around exchanges as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is where the content it gets hosted,
this is usually it's a data center which belong not exactly to IXP, but one of member, usually large member that came from Moscow or something like that, because you know it's huge money to build a data center itself. So data center usually belongs to one of members. But for largest IXPs like MSKX, St. Petersburg IX, and so on, they do have own large data centers, of course.
So I think obviously on opposite sides of a conflict right now, Russia and Ukraine are both really interesting because both countries, if you look on a per country basis, Russia and Ukraine have been moving up in the rankings of how much bandwidth is produced on a per country basis for a long time and are very near the tops of the list right now. And that trend appears to be continuing. And so what you see is a huge amount of bandwidth coming out of Western Europe, but that's in many cases one huge exchange point in a country and then a bunch of very small ones, whereas in Russia and Ukraine, what you find is a sort of medium number of medium-sized exchange points, and similarly, sort of medium number or large number of medium-sized internet service providers, and that creates a much more competitive environment than you find in Western Europe or the US, and that appears to be driving a huge amount of growth. So yeah, Russia and Ukraine both are kind of shooting up in the amount of bandwidth.
Yeah, you're right, you're right.
Bevel, you had remote questions, or who? Yes, sorry, the remote moderator.
Faisal Hassan from ISOC, Bangladesh. Are there examples of exchange points based on software-defined networks?
Well, so in Japan, there are both commercially operated exchange points, and there's also a very, very healthy academically operated exchange point operated by WIDE. And WIDE experimented with sort of virtual distributed exchange based on MPLS. And that's about as close as we get to software-defined exchange points. There are experiments with this. People are playing with it, but that was actually routing production traffic for a little while and was not terribly successful. The general problem with software-defined networking is the question of sort of security and stability, and it's getting better and better. For now, though, in an Ethernet switch, not a lot of complexity is needed, and people seem over 400 exchanges out there in the world. There are always experiments happening, and there are always examples of success and examples of failure. And so if you don't want to experiment, if you just want something that will be successful, the trick is to go and look at examples of success and see how it is that they got started. Don't copy what they are right now, copy their method for getting there. Pinder.
I just want to observe that I really enjoyed that last question about SDNs, because separating the control plane from this networks are really notoriously difficult to upgrade wholesale. And so yes, there is a very attractive promise, but I'm not aware of any SDN exchange point. Although if SDNs live up to their promise, I think we're looking at a very different internet as a whole, not just exchange points. And that's the whole. Will it be the same engineers who built the exchange point? Probably.
Malcolm?
Thank you, Bill. Malcolm Hutty from the London Internet Exchange. Bill, before we had those last two questions, you invited me to come in on some of the issues of building exchanges from the first steps and the trust and importance of trust and so forth. And so coming back to that, for those that are not familiar with Links, Links is now enjoying 20 years as its 20th year as a established internet exchange. It's one of the largest exchanges in Europe, but we are very committed to the idea that it needs to be a bottom-up process for building an exchange, and still as a very established and our answer to them, I think, may interest you. It was that we would be delighted to do so, but, and it's a big but, it can only work if this has the wholehearted buy-in of the networking peering community. And so any active work that we could do would be only that which was designed towards building and establishing that support, and we weren't going to go putting switches in or building data centers or anything like that until we were sure that there was a critical mass of networks that actually wanted us to do this. And that process needed to be worked through. Now, of course, this was slightly challenging for a government body that basically had an end of year, a budget that needed to be spent by an end of year and so forth. But there's no point, we didn't really need the money, we didn't really care about the money. as you say, the equipment is cheap. Certainly the equipment for links isn't cheap, but the equipment for an IX South Wales would be cheap. But the investment that's needed is exactly what you were saying, in building that community that actually wants to work that way. Other areas of outreach that Links has been involved in is largely towards explaining our process, our experience, to others that are establishing mutual exchanges, so that they can learn in as much as they think is appropriate to their own situation from our experience. And there we would say self-governing membership models are very important. We believe that that really helps establish that trust, because it gives the potential participants the confidence that they are building something that will always be responsive to them. That internet exchange points are a scale business. The bigger it gets, the more you want to join it, and then you can't really, it's very, very difficult to move away. There's no reason to move away. So before you join something that's starting, you really need to have the confidence that this is always going to be working for you and in your interest. And a membership model there that is thoroughly committed to neutrality between its members, that has the members in control of the organisation, in control of the board of the organisation, we believe is crucial to that success. As a result of that, certainly, I know that there are a good number of IXPs around the world that have simply taken our constitution and applied it all with their own little mods and so forth. And from time to time, when we hear that this has happened and we make our own updates or clarifications to our constitution, we have to send out an email saying, by the way guys, just thought you'd like to know that we found this bug in the constitution. It's up to you what you do, it's your constitution now, but there you have it. Anyway, I hope that was of some interest to the community.
Very much, thank you. I think we have time for one last remark or comment, and yeah.
Yes, I want just to share with all of you that 2 years ago we signed the Internet Exchange Federation, Euro IX, Asia Pacific IX, and LAC IX, and then Africa is joining us, and I expect the North American Association will join us in the future, in the near future, just so everyone knows that.
Any other comments or questions from the floor? Okay, well, thank you all very, very much for participating this morning, and I'm sure our panelists would be happy to answer any further questions you have informally, or if you catch them throughout the rest of the week. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.